Hi, I'm David Edelman, a neuroscientist and paleoanthropologist, and welcome to the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars. Roundtable episodes of the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars were recorded and filmed in my parents' dining room in La Jolla, where they lived for more than 2 decades. This and the upcoming excursions into the nature of consciousness are a special tribute to my dad, Nobel laureate Gerald Edelman, and a prodigious scientific and intellectual output born of a bottomless imagination, boundless energy, and immense creativity. I think of these podcasts as fitting bookends for all the discussions we had about the nature of consciousness, and in fact, all the other unresolved biological questions during our years together in Southern California. We're here today with Bernie, acclaimed author in psychobiology, including his newest book, On Consciousness, Science and Subjectivity, Updated Works in Global Workspace Theory. Bernie is the recipient of the 2019 Hermann von Helmholtz Life Contribution Award by the International Neural Network Society, which recognizes outstanding achievements in perception by individuals whose scientific life contribution to the field of neural networks was proven to be paradigm-changing and long-lasting. Also joining us is Dr. Jay Giedd, a child, adolescent, and geriatric psychiatrist by training. Jay is the Chief of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at UC San Diego, Fukuoka University in Japan, and at Johns Hopkins in reproductive medicine. His overarching interest for many years has been the brain and how it changes throughout life. As scientists, as philosophers, as human observers, under what conditions can we infer that some living organism is conscious? Consciousness is truly the difference that makes a difference. Today's discussion is about the rich variety of conscious experience by virtue of the richness of our sensoria and the capacity for the brain to pick this all apart and put it back together, both developmentally and evolutionarily. So Bernie, in a nutshell, what are the key points of Global Workspace? Sort of give me a kind of a nutshell description of the theory.
Yeah, it's really extremely simple. It involves a place where different actors can work together and they can vote for or against some idea that's been posted by one of the actors. And then basically the most popular idea, the rich get richer, right? And so you broadcast the most popular idea. And that was a very new idea when Alan Newell hit on it in the 1970s at Carnegie Mellon University. Because subjectively what happens, of course, is that we think the flow of consciousness, the spontaneous stream of consciousness, is the only thing that's really going on. And it's really hard to realize how much unconscious intelligence we have. But it's a ton of intelligence because that's another way of talking about memory. And memory by now has a quarter of a quadrillion, is that right?
Yes, synapses, yeah.
Something like that. It's fabulous. And it does interpenetrate everything we're conscious of, but somehow we still maintain stability of the conscious sensory world, right? Maybe not the conscious belief world, but certainly the conscious sensory world, which is mostly biological, so it has to be stable, otherwise you die.
That's right.
Right. So after 50 years, literally, of going from Herb Simon in the 1950s, working with a chess master named Adrian the Groot, and who was a Gestalt psychologist. He was very interested in the mental process of chess players, and it was very puzzling. And one of the puzzles that they found with verbal protocols, right, chess players talking through whatever they thought their thoughts were, right, because they weren't sure that what their thoughts were. They just thought what their thoughts were. Anyway, so somebody's scribbling this down or typing it on a mechanical typewriter, and those are protocols. And the really weird thing at the time was that this seemed to be a serial process, but the brain doesn't look serial.
Right.
It looks massively parallel. So we start off with this enormous paradox, and until Newell's work, it made no sense whatsoever, because Newell comes from exactly the same, what's called the cognitive architecture tradition. And by the time Newell comes along, we have enough computational power, basically, to have these little agents running back and forth and sending messages to this common informational space.
Right.
But the paradox continues because we don't really have an explanation in brain terms, for example, of why this should be so, because you have to understand that people get killed, right? That when they're texting on their cell phones, they walk into traffic, it's almost as if they're blind.
Right. It's interesting. Back in the day, as in the day that Dan Dennett published Consciousness Explained, I think it was, he likened the brain to a serial processor running, or a parallel processor running a virtual serial machine. He said that once, I believe. I think, which is okay. That was actually, a fairly insightful thing to say.
Right.
You mentioned actors when you were talking about actors in the global workspace. Who are the actors?
I've arrived at that very hesitantly, and over a very long time. I don't like the term actors, but it turns out that there are agentive processes in the brain. They're agentive in the sense that they have criteria by which they try to meet, and they're neural nets, let's say, some kind of fuzzy fashion of neural nets that are homeostatic, first of all, right? So that they're constrained, they can't blow up the brain, and secondly, in some real sense, much like DNA or the expression of DNA and proteins, there is an outcome towards which they emerge. There's a fate of some kind. And some of those obviously biological, some of it is metabolic to keep the thing running, but some of it has to do with adaptation to novelty, right? And that's why I believe why we have this humongously expensive cortex, which makes the human head a target for every predator who ever stalks us, which is all of them. So that's the essential idea.
One other question. Global Workspace has been interpreted in a number of ways over a number of years by a number of people.
Right.
How in the main have they done? Have there been some groups or some individual scientists who've done a good job? Are there some who sort of stand out as sort of having taken the ball and just ran totally off the field?
Oh, for sure. Yes. Popularity has its penalties, just like lonesomeness has.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, exactly. And so people, especially, I'm going to name computer science people and even mathematicians are very seduced by the elegance of this global workspace thing. And it's actually very good mathematics, computational mathematics that's been performed that goes beyond Turing machines. It's really, really cool. So there's been tremendous progress, but there's also been tremendous misinterpretation.
So just an example of a sort of a prominent misinterpretation. Who took the ball and just went home with it, and you never came back to be seen again?
I think all the people who think that the internet is going to become conscious any day now.
And so people who have invoked the term global workspace but refer to the internet, among other things.
Something computational, something
Right.
that is not biological.
Gotcha.
And the fact is that all the evidence we have comes from psychology and biology, and you can consider psychology to be within biology in a broad way. But I prefer to use the term psychobiology because consciousness is truly both different and highly functional. It's not some side effect of the locomotive, blowing off steam.
Right.
That metaphor is so wrong. It's hard to exaggerate it. It doesn't even work in terms of thermodynamics, right? Because the steam whistle borrows power from that which drives the wheels. So totally wrong, but it's very popular. And it's one of those seductive metaphors that turn out to be very misleading. There are other seductive metaphors that are not so bad. And scientists have always kind of loved metaphors, or argued about them at least. And some of them turn out to be useful, and some of them turn out to be dreadful.
Very good. So I think we've more or less have a good précis of global workspace generally. And as with many good ideas in science, particularly massive global theories of great import, there are going to be many people who are enamored of those ideas. But among those people, there are going to be quite a lot who develop, fairly serious misprisions about the idea and completely misinterpret it.
Absolutely right. And as you know, some of the early models about humanity were totally mechanistic.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm reminded of Donald Knuth, the computer scientist quote. He said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that ultimately that's the test of a construct like Global Workspace Theory. Does it lead us to greater knowledge? Does it suggest areas of research? Does it make predictions that we can test?
Exactly.
And that's where I think that your idea has stood the test of time. It's succeeded on all of those fronts. So whether it's right, in perfect, representation of consciousness or not, it's right in the sense that it's been useful.
Exactly.
Moved us forward.
I believe that's correct. And the other thing that I keep on wanting to pound the table about is that it's evidence.
Yes. And constantly refined.
60 years of
dynamic.
evidence.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It had testable implications.
As is all good science.
Yeah, that's and we all know that, but we rarely. We don't always. But
We need to be reminded often.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right or wrong, I think we can agree that global workspace theory, and I do believe, in fact, that it's right, has moved the field very far forward. So let's turn briefly to perceptual learning. Now, I'm a musician by avocation, of course, not professionally, because if I did it professionally, I would have starved to death many years ago. In any case, I'm an amateur musician. I think that's a really, really good example of perceptual learning. Bernie, what do you think?
When you become a musician, or when you become a painter, or when you become a scientist for that matter, there is perceptual learning that happens. If I look at a traditional X-ray of a human body, and I'm uninformed about that, I'm untrained in interpreting X-rays, I'm going to see it differently. From the specialist, from the radiologist, and this is life. This used to be called, and still is called, perceptual learning, but it's transitions in consciousness is not.
But from like the brain anatomy perspective, well, it's so powerful though. I mean, in terms of the DNA, and it lays out like a very broad range of possibilities, sort of like a scoreboard in terms of it has a certain number of rows of lights and a certain number of columns of lights, but then life itself, different ones light up together.
Right.
It's so broad. I mean, in terms of what our brains can learn. Music is a good example. So we studied people with absolute or perfect pitch.
Yes.
And no matter what your genetics are, if you don't have something between ages 5 and 8, some training, some system where you link the sound, you don't have
never
it.
developed.
Really hard to get it then when you're 16 and 17. So in countries like, Vietnam is one example of tonal languages, it's like 15 to 20%, a huge percent of the population has absolute.
Absolute.
One being you can get the pitch without any prompt, and the other with it. But to what extent could we train this, and all? To what extent could we learn to discern colors if we practiced it? And that's what also fascinates me, because the very optimistic aspect of this is like it seems to be almost unlimited of what you could have the brain become very skilled in. And so I find one of those upbeat aspects of our brain taking 20 some years to mature, so to speak, The huge upside is that there's so many options we can do. And I kind of probably overuse the example of reading, which is about 5,000 years old, that most humans have never read a single word. It's not part of our brain. We weren't designed to read.
Right.
But some people spend a lot of their day doing it.
Right.
And we can pull it off. Right. I wonder what other capacities there are if we get really good at knowing how the brain does specialize. Can we guide it? Can we have it specialize in things that are going to be useful? Because now we're teaching kids facts and figures still. Like how high is the mountain? How long is the river and stuff? You can look it up in 15 seconds on your phone.
And that's a double-edged sword, but we can talk about that later.
But they will need to use it to solve problems and stuff as well. And we talked a little bit the other day about should you memorize your times tables, right? And I would say yes. But if you push me, I can't really prove it. I think you should know your times tables. Even though you can look it up, but still there's some minimal body of evidence, or GPS systems. So demonstrated, we actually are getting worse at navigating, right? So what? So what? We have our phone. We don't need it.
Personally, I can't get worse at navigating than I am.
Oh, you're not as bad as I am.
But
my nickname is the skeleton in the desert.
Yeah, but I would say I would kind of go so what though, right? Because we do have the technologies.
We do.
The power of mic knowledge. But even the ability to use a sextant, right? Yeah. People's like the point at the, you point at the horizon. Yeah, no, I can. I can.
It's a lost art.
Can't use a slide rule and stuff. But I would kind of say, well, so what? So we don't need to use the slide. We don't need to use the sextants. We don't need to navigate by the stars. But then, can we replace it with things that would be useful? Which I think nowadays is pattern recognition. Huge amounts of data. That's what do we do with it? How do we use it to solve problems? Right. We can teach that. I think we can, formally attack it in schools and education, young ages and old, but we aren't yet because all of this is so new. It's hard to know how to prepare today's children for their future.
That's right.
You mean the art of telling computers how to perform pattern recognition?
Of humans. I mean, in terms of because we're still. One of the probably few domains, we're still really good at it. And we can recognize, personal example, just kind of going back to a class reunion in terms of 40 years later. And you recognize people. Right. So I used to have hair, and I have a beard. I can totally different almost any way I can imagine. So people are kind of like, are you, and that's actually hard for computers to do.
It's very hard.
They're getting better and better at it. But how do you teach kids, to solve problems with the data? Right. Because if they can, some of them just take to it naturally. They're amazing accomplishments, and the data is like a click away. Almost everything you can think of, there's knowledge about it. And it's a deal. Yeah.
So let's take stock of where we're at. Let me just see whether I get this right, and you guys can jump in. Mm-hmm. We started with the problem of defining consciousness. What is it? And I offered a definition. The idea that in order to be conscious of something, of the great big out there, whatever, there has to be something that you might call a perceptual unity. The idea that you're binding various sensoria together, or even submodalities of one sensory apparatus. Vision is a good example. Mm-hmm. It's not just about one thing, right? As we know, it's about many things, and that's reflected in the organization of visual cortex. All kinds of areas, up to 70, depending on who you talk to in a primate, in non-human primate and human beings. So we talked about, at least, I started with my definition of consciousness as the notion of binding the world together, the multiple sensory inputs, as a sensory whole. And then the second part was the persistence of that sensory whole in memory. That the fact that those neuronal groups that are dynamically representing this, they more or less hold together. There's a coherent constellation of neural activity, which is based on the anatomy, that is, it persists, right? Mm-hmm. So do you think, just a yes or no, because we'll go on from here, but are you guys, do you guys think that does that sit well with you, that idea?
It sits extremely well. Yes.
I guess the binding aspect. So but then it keeps going. So now we have binding together the bound, sort of
Right.
thing, like,
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so now it's ducks and turkeys.
Further
and
elaborated
then it's,
through
and,
your life.
And it goes on for quite a ways in terms of
yeah.
these sort of thinking of the different parts of the brain as being letters of the alphabet.
Sure.
And the letters then words, and the words
Sure.
then sentences.
Sure.
And at some level, then we have, maybe it's a paragraph or something. That's what I would say. Now it's conscious.
Yes.
Like,
Oh, sure.
But I don't know if it's one sentence or a
So
chapter,
who knows
yeah.
when that Rubicon is,
Yeah.
right? So that may be an open-ended question we can't solve today.
But sort of
But-
the very, full circle kind of thing, like when you say, like, what do I think consciousness is? That's kind of what I think it is. It's when
Gotcha.
it's when this binding, when this integration, this weaving becomes sufficiently sophisticated,
Right.
complicated. That's when consciousness emerges.
There you go.
As speculation.
And as with so many things in science in general, but in neuroscience in particular, the question of how much is necessary, what is necessary, and how much of that what is necessary to yield something like a conscious experience, that's really very open-ended, and we're still struggling with it.
Yeah.
I think.
But when I was the age of some of our audience, right, in terms of in undergraduate college, though, it was very much like a philosophical sort of notion. Like, well, we'll never know, but maybe. But what's exciting to me is now it's not just philosophical, because with brain imaging techniques and other approaches, we can kind of get at some of these things. We can
Sure.
actually measure these.
Sure.
To me, that's cool. Like that, we haven't really had that ability before to
Right.
go beyond, more Aristotelian sort of thought experiments. We can actually test some of these
Sure.
things with
Absolutely.
clever
Absolutely.
questions and people.
We talked earlier about this sort of Rubicon that you cross. And in Jay's world, the Rubicon might be developmental in the sense of what isn't fully developed that will preclude a conscious experience, and what happens at a certain point developmentally that yields conscious experience. What changes in the brain? We talked about that a little bit. And so in essence, we were kind of nibbling around the edges of the sine qua non of the conscious experience, anatomically, physiologically. But Bernie, I think the global workspace theory has a lot to sort of contribute to this.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would like to do is ask you, relative to global workspace, this global view of consciousness in the brain,
Mm-hmm.
what areas would you say, and we're going to be mammal-centric, at least for the moment, but because I'm going to hit you up later with a counterexample in the octopus.
Okay.
But in the mammal, what areas are relevant to the conscious experience in the mammalian brain?
The answer is at least twofold. For this conscious state, and you both know this, for the conscious waking state, there's brainstem mechanisms, and they pretty much, if you touch yourself back here and feel the back of your cranium, let's call that brainstem, and it does project forward into the thalamus, and the thalamus looks like the anatomical center of the cortex, even though it's not. And so then we get neocortex, thalamus, plus this huge expansion of the cortex that occurs with our biological ancestors. So cortex is the organ of mind, which was, I believe, Penfield's discovery in 1934, after studying waking human patients, epileptic patients who badly needed surgery. And nobody quite knew how do you do the right kind of surgery without endangering people too much. And the Penfield team, along with others, discovered how to do that. And suddenly you could talk to the cortex, right?
Yeah.
And that's been repeated. By now, I think there are 200 or more studies in the literature using pretty much that same setup. So you open
Direct cortical stimulation.
Exactly right. So you open the cortex, just a little flap. You don't want to affect anything, and you protect it. And then you very gently stimulate the motor cortex, for example. Or more interestingly, actually, this sensory body map, S1, called S1 for sensory 1. And suddenly this patient goes, I feel something. Holy camoly. This was not exactly the first time, but it was close to the first time when, by the time he got done, he had 1,200 surgical patients that he had studied, and that kind of procedure became rock solid, and it has improved since that time. So we can talk to cortex, and so this is no longer entirely speculative.
And through Penfield's work, we were able to at least get the sort of the initial sort of framework of specialized brain anatomy. So that is
That's right.
areal
Yeah.
specializations for certain kinds of things.
Right.
Even though now we know that it wasn't completely, it's not wrong, but it's not the whole picture. So you can't
Right.
simply talk about brain specialization.
Yeah, but that's the nature of science.
That's
right?
the nature of
We're
science.
always ignorant.
He also
That's right.
predated, by far, fMRI.
Mhm.
But he actually noticed it very early on that he could see the different colors in terms of blood flow and different activation.
Really?
He kind of nailed it in terms of fMRI, functional MRI, uses the MRI
Signal.
machine, but it's basically a blood flow detection.
Right.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
oxygenated blood has different magnetic properties than deoxygenated, and you can use this principle to kind of see where the action is.
Right.
It's a little bit indirect. It's sort of 3 to 5 seconds after the action, and it's. But Penfield in his writings, he kind of noted, that you could literally, once the lid is off, there's no pain receptors on the brain, so you're good to go.
Absolutely.
He could see flashes of color related to blood flow in areas of activation.
Really?
It sort of was small potatoes compared to the cool aspect of touching this part of the brain and listening to specific memory,
Right.
magical type of discovery.
Really?
But he was like his colleague Hebb at the same
Right.
place of time, so far ahead of their time, and we're kind of now rediscovering many of the principles they put forward.
And when you mentioned fMRI and its basis, how it works, you bring up an interesting point as well, which is that technically, we're very limited still. I mean, even though it seems like an incredible advancement between Penfield's capacity or ability to sort of observe differences in coloration based on blood flow. But the fact is that when you do fMRI, what you're really looking at is you're looking at differential brain metabolism. Essentially, brain cells that are more active are hungrier brain cells.
Yeah.
They need more glucose, they need more oxygen. Blood flow is quite sensitive to that. So if you can observe blood flow and a distinction, so some areas are getting more blood flow, other areas are getting less blood flow, that is at least indirectly relates to higher function. So in effect, fMRI is giving us a sort of an indirect read, as you said, of relative activity in one area versus another area. The downside to that, of course, is spatially, it's a little bit limited and limiting.
It is, yes.
So a millimeter, maybe a square millimeter, and of course, there's a universe in a.
But still, your points are very well taken, because it's very easy to overestimate the capabilities.
That's right.
And Edelman kind of looked at in terms of if you just put a brain picture in the paper that has even nothing to do with it, other scientists will rate the paper as better.
Of course.
If it's a colored picture, even more.
It's
it
amazing,
better.
isn't it?
It's not this sort of irrational persuasion.
That's sort of
And even though my career is brain imaging, I'm much more worried sort of about the overinterpretations and people like in the courtroom and stuff like that.
Right.
That I feel oddly sort of on the other side sometimes. Well, this is a fabulous technology.
Really,
However, and because all the these are very hard to overcome limitations. Actually,
They're very hard to overcome, and there's even the temporal limitation,
Yeah.
which is to say, it's not just simply something that's scanning your brain.
Right.
It's the computational processes
Yeah.
behind that. There's a computer, there's essentially microprocessors that have to pull this data together, analyze it. And when you're reconstructing a single slice from an fMRI, let's say you're getting a coronal section of a head out of this, it's taking at least a second to get that data together, which means that your temporal slices are up to a second apart.
Right.
And that could be a lot of time vis-a-vis brain activity.
So this is an argument in favor of Penfield.
Yes.
Because
and a tribute to his genius. So
yes, exactly. And his dedication, and actually also his ethics, which is very much worth talking about, because all those patients are still in the archives.
Sure.
They have not been published to protect the privacy of the patients.
Right.
He was a very great man.
Yeah.
So anyway, The Penfield procedure, which, as I'm going to call it, he didn't want to call it that. He wanted to call it the Montreal procedure, right? And because he was appropriately modest. The Montreal procedure, let's call it for now, is still being done, and it's been rediscovered, highly developed, and so now we can get neurons in real time in a certain sense. So whenever one little neuron fires, and they've done this beautiful work with the temporal lobe neurons, which is how many billion, I don't know, but you can pick out just one neuron, and when it fires, you can give essentially instantaneous feedback.
And you can correlate it too in if you have a patient expressing some sort of epileptiform issue, you can do an open skull surgery. You can put a massive web of electrodes up to 1,000, say more than that at this point. What Itzhak Fried does at UCLA, you can stick a web of 1,000 electrodes and do essentially either a sophisticated field potential recording, or you can sync individual electrodes in, and you can actually record individual neurons' responses to something out in the world, which is really cool.
So I think we can all agree that some serious technical strides have been made, and we're entering into a very exciting era of experimentation. And on that note, I'd like to thank Bernie Baars and Jay Giedd for a great conversation. I'm neuroscientist David Edelman. Thank you for listening and for tuning into the podcast On Consciousness with Bernard Baars.